We're starting our conversation today on what it means to be wise at heart. So Paul was preaching Jesus to Antioch in Pisidia. And as he's preaching Jesus, he starts off by actually starting out too early. He tells the whole story. So he kind of comes with he doesn't just say what he wants to say. He starts the story of Jesus right at the beginning and kind of goes through the phases and the different parts of the Old Testament and actually does a little summary. And we pick it up in Acts chapter 13, verse 21. It says, afterward, they asked for a king. So God gave them Saul, the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. And when he had removed him, he raised up for them David as king, to whom he gave testimony and said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all my will. From this man's seed, according to the promise, God raised up for Israel a Savior, Jesus. Paul is telling the story of Jesus, and he's starting the story of Jesus by telling the story of David. And as part of the story, he's telling the story of David, this man after God's own heart, this man that had a wise heart. He was wise in heart. What does it mean to be a man after God's own heart? So there's a couple of possible interpretations of that line, right? It could be that his heart was what God's heart for us is, right? That would make him a man after mine own heart. It was, if David was a man that was after the heart of God, he reflected the heart of God, it would make him a man after God's own heart. It could also be that he was a man after God's heart. So he was pursuing, he was running after, he was trying to be with, he was pursuing the heart of God, and that would make him a man after God's heart. He would be running after the heart of God. The third possible solution is that he could have been a man that was one that carried the heart of God. That God's heart was his heart, and that God's heart was in him. It's interesting if you think of the possible solutions or the possible meanings of this phrase, a man after God's own heart. But as you read the story of David throughout the books of 1 and 2 Samuel, you get a little bit in Chronicles, and then you get all these Psalms that he wrote, right? So the book of Psalms, David didn't write all of it, but about half of it was Psalms of David. And you read these Psalms and you get this idea that this guy was different. David was different than any other Bible character. I honestly don't think there's any other character like David. He was just different. His reactions to things were different. He lived differently. He had a heart that was differently. He lived from the heart. He got away with things that none of us get away with. He got away with all kinds of things, and he did things that everybody thought was weird, and he got away with it. David lived differently, and I think part of the reason why David lived differently, why David had this different experience, was part of his heart. David carried something which today we define as emotional intelligence. Who's ever heard of emotional intelligence? Okay, so emotional intelligence, we've got IQ, this is EQ, right? So this is your emotional ability to figure things out, okay? I'm not very smart, so I need something very simple, and I need pictures, okay? So if you've never heard of emotional intelligence, here's Emotional Intelligence 101, okay? Number one, emotional intelligence deals with your ability to understand emotions, right? You've got to understand it. If you can't understand emotions, you can't have emotional intelligence, right? Now, yes, gentlemen, I am saying that we need to understand women, okay? That is what I'm saying, okay? But it's also women having to understand men. It's our ability to understand emotions. And oftentimes emotions are like water, and then we need a container for it. And when we get a word for it, we suddenly have a container that we can do something with the water. Have you ever tried to keep water in your hands? It's very hard until you find the container. Now, sometimes being able to say, this thing I'm feeling, this is anger, okay? The fact that we lost the game when we were 17 points ahead, this is anger, okay? This emotion is called anger, okay? It is anger. How many dumb penalties can one team accumulate in one game? anger. Okay, this is anger. You see how it's but I'm able to understand it, and the more I understand it, the more I'm able to interact with it. So that's the second part of emotional intelligence, is once you understand it, now you've got to interact with it. You've got to go down, boy, is it really that? Yes, it is that important. No. Okay, so you go through that process, because now that you understand it, you can interact with it. So emotional intelligence is not just understanding how you feel, it's understanding how you feel and being able to interact with that understanding. Some of us needs to grow in our understanding. Some of us needs to grow in our interaction. But emotional intelligence doesn't end with me. It also has to do with my ability to interact with others and to understand the emotions of others. So those 4 quadrants makes up my level of emotional intelligence. It's my ability to understand my emotions. It's my ability to understand the emotions of others. It's my ability to interact with my own emotions and my ability to interact with the emotions of others. And David had this down. This guy had it. Go read some of those Psalms. Go study his story. David had emotional intelligence. If you read the story of David, what you'll find is that David goes through this process where he's anointed as king, right? So the prophet comes to him and tells him, you're going to be the king of Israel. And he has the emotional intelligence to not let his own pride overcome him. David has emotional intelligence. He understands the emotion. He puts it away and he goes back to tending sheep. And he does a great job of it. He has the ability to not just react to whatever's happening around him, but he has the ability to respond. When Goliath comes along and he threatens the armies of God, we find that David comes into the situation, and when no one else had the emotional intelligence to go, yes, he's big, I am afraid, but God, David enters the room, and what does he go? He says, but God. And then they say, that's fantastic, David. What you need is, here's Saul's armor. Put on the armor and go fight him. He says, no. I'm not going to put on something that doesn't fit me. I'm going to stick to what I have. Right? What's that? That's emotional intelligence. He understands something they don't understand. He understands his identity. He has the ability to interact with him. Then eventually Saul kind of loses his head and he tries to kill David. What does David do? David doesn't fight back. David doesn't say, I am the anointed king of Israel. None of that. David just dodges the spears. That's all he does, right? He just dodges the spears. He gets out of the way. And then the king pursues him. Eventually has to run. David doesn't go and throw a pity party under a tree. That's Jurie, okay? David isn't like that. David goes away and he says, in due time, God will get me there. He doesn't just have the emotional intelligence to look after himself in those moments. No, David goes and he rallies an army. They call it a David's army, okay? It's a nice way of saying, if somebody says you're part of a David's army, it's not a compliment, okay? So let me teach you some Christianese. He rallies an army of all the broken, lame, those who are wounded. He gets them all together. They become his army. And yes, it's very much a ragtag bunch of nobodies that the world has given up on. They become part of his army. But hey, David has emotional intelligence. He heals them. He restores them. And later on, we read about David's mighty men. Same guys, they've just gone through a process. Same guys, they've just gone through a story. Same guys, they've just been shaped and formed. Then David becomes king. He's a successful king. He's a great king. And then while he's a great king, he makes a fantastic big mess. Okay, he sleeps with the neighbor's wife. Okay, he has that whole thing with Bathsheba, and it doesn't go well, and then he's afraid that the neighbor would find it out. So he makes a plan. He has him killed. Nothing major. That's some pretty big mistakes, right? I mean, if you just heard this out of context, it would be, talk about canceling someone, okay? David would have been canceled, okay? He's like big time canceled. It's over. But why isn't David's story over? Because when David messes up, David runs back to God and he repents. And he says, God, yes, God, help me out. He goes to God. He says, Lord, restore me. Far be it from me. And he actually mourns and he trusts God for restoration. And then his life goes well again. And then his son Absalom, that would be born out of his marriage with Bathsheba, Absalom would go, and Solomon would be born out of that marriage. But his other son Absalom would actually go, and he would decide that unlike his dad, he's going to aspire to the throne. And he kills a lot of his siblings, and he goes and he has himself anointed as the new king, and he actually makes war against David. And rather than David going, well, I'm going to sort you out, Absalom, no, David continues to honor him and love him. Although he protects his people and he protects his kingdom, he trusts God to restore his kingdom. What do we see in every phase and time in David's life? We see that he carries something. What he carries is what the series is about. What he carries is wisdom of the heart. He has a wise heart. Now, you've heard of Solomon, right? The wisest man that ever lived, right? So one of his sons with Bathsheba, he'll have a son that's called Solomon. Solomon would become the king after David. And Solomon prayed to God, and he received this wisdom. And people would say that Solomon was the wisest man to ever live. And I think Solomon had wisdom of the head in a way that no one else ever had. And I don't know that anybody ever will after him. But I often pray, God, give me the wisdom of Solomon so that I might understand things. Well, I want to tell you, I think we need to pray for the wisdom of heart of David, because David understood things that Solomon didn't get. And sometimes we're all about understanding things up here, and we forget that understanding things in here is equally important. Moses wrote a psalm in Psalm 90 verse 12, and he says, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. I'm trusting God that we will gain a heart of wisdom. I'm trusting God that as we journey together these next couple of weeks, that God will ignite something in us, which is a heart of wisdom, which is a wisdom of the heart, an ability to not just be wise in our understanding, but to be wise in our interaction with God, to be wise in our dealing with our own emotions, with our own insides, and a wisdom of engaging with other people. I think a lot of people fail today, not because of a lack of education, but because of lack of emotional intelligence. I think our world is poor right now. People are struggling to live well. They know a lot, they have access, they have opportunity, they have potential, but they're struggling to simply live well. They're struggling with the wisdom of heart. So the ancient Egyptians loved making people into mummies, okay? So they used to do this. They used to preserve the body for the afterlife. So what the Egyptians believed is the Egyptians were convinced that your actual body would be resurrected and it will continue to live in, after you've died. So what they would do is they would set you up for this afterlife. They'd normally give you a boat to sail around in. They'll give you some gold to pay your way. They do all these different things, but they learned how to mummify a body, and it was a whole thing to mummify a body. You can see some of these mummified bodies, not in Egypt. No, there's not many of them around there anymore. They've all been stolen and they're now in the British Museum, okay? So if you want to see, I'm sorry, I do apologize. I saw some of you guys online. I'm sorry, but it's true, okay? So these mummies in the British Museum, if you go look at them, it's real fascinating. They've really preserved them super well. So the whole, I know they go wrong in the horror movies with all these things, but, it's really well-preserved bodies that's thousands of years old. And it's amazing what they did. They would cut open the people and they would take out all the organs, and, they'll put your one organ in one jar and another organ in another jar. This is amazing. I can see this is going down well, but I've got a point, I promise. Just hang with me a little bit, okay? And they would put all your organs in different jars to help preserve them, right? But there's one organ that they threw away because they didn't see much need for it, okay? And the organ that the ancient Egyptians didn't even bother preserving was the brain, okay? Because they were convinced that the only function of the brain was to create mucus. Now, I sometimes think of that only if you've ever had, a serious allergy situation, it might feel like, it's the only function of your brain is to create mucus, but we know it's not the truth, right? But they thought that the brain had no other function. It was just one big snot producer, okay? It was just a, massive machine up there and they threw it away, okay? That's the point. They didn't preserve it. You don't find any mummies with brains. If you watch a lot of horror movies, that's a good thing. No? No. Okay, moving right along. Okay, this is going all the wrong places. But here's the thing. They were convinced that the center of your being wasn't your brain, but it was actually your heart. They thought that all the thinking, all the feeling, all the being happens in your heart. And they might have had it wrong in the afterlife, but they did have it right in some ways. Because oftentimes we live our entire lives according to our brains, when in actual fact, there's more to us than just what we can think and understand. And the more they study, the more they realize that who we are is more than the muscle that pumps the blood, but is also more than the electrons that's firing up here. There's more to us. There's more to what it means to be human than simply the processes that we go through. And when the Bible speaks about the heart, it speaks about more than the organ at the center of your body. It speaks about something more than that. And to understand that, we've got to apply the principle that we learned when we did the Genesis series. Who remembers the Genesis series? Roots, right? During the Roots series, in the beginning, when the beginning began, that's when it all began. In the beginning, when it all began, right? You've got it. Thanks. Everybody's very grateful for that reminder. I can see the appreciation throughout the room. But you guys will remember that we spoke about something called the first mention principle. Do you guys remember the first mention principle? Basically, the first mention principle was this principle that what would happen is every time something's mentioned the first time in the Bible, that first mention establishes the meaning of the word for the rest of the Bible. Let's find the first mention of the word heart. It's in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 5. So Genesis 6 verse 5, it says that when the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, the context here is God speaking about the flood, and he's about to call Noah to build an ark, right? And that every intent and thoughts of the heart was only evil continually. Now, it's interesting that he says the intents and the thoughts, right? So clearly the mention of heart here expands it beyond the blood pumping muscle in the middle of your physical body, right? Because it's the thoughts and the intents, the ability to interact. Everything was continually evil. The Hebrew word used here is the word leb. It means your inner man, your will, your heart, your understanding, your midst, in the midst of, the middle, your inclination, your conscience. It's the seat of your appetites, the seat of your emotion and passions. This word heart, leb, it refers to your innermost being, the center of your being. And then this verse goes on in verse 6, it says, and the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his... God was grieved in his heart. God doesn't have a big muscle that pumps blood throughout his body. Does he? No. God is spirit. God is love. God is not physical heart, but God as an inner person. God as an inside. And so when the Bible speaks of the inside, it speaks of the way that we've been created in the image of God. And just like God has a seat of conscience, we have a seat of conscience. What makes us different? We've got a will. We've got a desire. We can choose whether or not we serve God. So God is using this mirror in the very first mention of heart. It's mentioned in the fact that we have a likeness of God. We've got a spirit man. We've got an inside. We've got an inner person that is who we really are. It's not just about our bodies. It's not just about the outside. It's about the inside. And I guess my question is, how's your inside? How's your heart? How's your inner person? How's your inner being? How are you doing on the inside? How are you doing in the seat of your person? How are you doing in the midst of who you are? How are you doing in your soul? How are you really? The Bible says in Proverbs 4 verse 23, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. I love this verse because it tells us what to guard. It tells us what to look after. It tells us what to protect. It's not your 401k. Don't look at those these days, by the way. Not a good idea. Okay, it's not your bank balance. It's not the car that you drive. It's not the house that you live in that determines your life. It's not the beauty that you hold or the amount of hair that you have that determines your life. Guard your heart above all else. Guard your inside. Guard your soul. How's your heart doing? How well are you doing on the inside? Proverbs 16:20 says this. It says, whoever gives thought to the word will discover good, and blessed is he who trusts in the Lord. The wise of heart, the wise of what? The wise of heart is called discerning, and sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. Good sense is a fountain of life to him who has it, but the instruction of fools is folly. Good sense is a fountain of life on your inside. What is it like to have a fountain of life in your inside? When I read that verse before in Proverbs 4:23, I was reading the New Living Translation. It's interesting if you look at the New King James Version of that same verse. So it said, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. The New King James Version says, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it springs the issues of life. What's happening in your heart causes the issues of life. So both these verses has this idea of the spring of life. If the spring is good, life is good. But if the spring is bad, life's a mess. How's your soul? How's your heart? Because the quality of your heart determines the quality of your life. And I think we hold a lot of things in our hearts while we're just trying to keep on with our lives sometimes. And we act as if it doesn't faze us or it doesn't influence us. And so we're just keeping up appearances. Anybody found themselves there? We're just keeping on. Keeping the outside pretty so that nobody knows what's happening in the soul. We keep the outside going so that nobody's aware of what's really happening in the inside. We spend so much time beautifying our outsides on a daily basis, but we spend no time on the inside. We will never leave the house with an undone outside, but we leave the house all the time with an undone inside. I think we've got our priorities wrong. Our outsides don't make the insides, but the insides do eventually make the outsides. We're all interacting with this world from the inside out. We've got to take care of the inside. Now, our interaction with the world is interesting, and Josh, if you can bring my prop for me, that would be fantastic. We interact with the outside of life in different ways, right? So the way we interact with the world. Thanks, buddy. Okay, so it's a birthday today, so it made me think of balloons, right? So Lene made sure that we think of balloons when we think of birthdays. By the way, if it's her birthday, when it's Lene's birthday, make sure you get some balloons, right? Okay. But here's the thing with this balloon, is this balloon has an inside and an outside. Do you notice that? Okay, the inside is a lot of breath. This one took a while to get this blown up. But anyway, okay, so there's an inside of the balloon and there's an outside of the balloon. And our outside is kind of determined in different ways, right? So the outside of our lives, we can kind of take our interactions with this world, and we can divide it in a couple of different ways. Your inside has a relationship with yourself. right? It's whether or not your emotions, right? If you think about it, you've got a interaction with self. You've got a emotional interaction, and you've got that side. You've got an interaction with others, right? So my outside interact with others, and that's part of the process, right? I either have healthy relationships or I have bad relationships, right? I have these interactions with others. I also have some interactions with work. Does anybody have interactions with work? Those can be great. They can be terrible, but we all have them, right? We've got these work interactions in life, and my inside's got to interact with work, and then my inside also has to interact with my health, right? So you might wonder, Jurie, didn't you say yourself already? Well, the self refers to my mental self, my emotional self. My health refers to my bodily self, right? I've got a physical self. And sometimes my emotional self is fine, but my body self is not fine, okay? This outside shell is not always in a good space, and that has an influence, right? So we're all interacting on these different levels. And to live a good life, you want to make sure that you interact well. What does that look like? Well, it looks like this. It looks like somebody that has your interactions with others represents relational completeness, right? You're relationally complete. You're in good space. Your work gives you a space of productive significance. You feel like you're making a difference. You're doing something that counts in life. Your health is at a place where you've got a good life balance. You're not neglecting your body at the cost of everything else. Your emotional state is in a place of emotional wellness, right? So you're finding yourself emotionally well. And when we find these different things in a good space, it's a good thing. But here's the thing is our lives tend to not be static like this. It's not a controlled environment because all these different interactions with ourselves has an influence on us, right? We can't say that these things are isolated. You know, when my health is bad, when there's pressure on my health, guess what? It puts pressure on the other parts of me, okay? And when my self is when I'm struggling with my emotions, it influences my work, right? And when work puts pressure on, okay, it puts some pressure on, you know, and life can be cruel, you know. Some of us know some others that doesn't always play well with us. They sometimes hurt us. And when they hurt us, it puts pressure on the other parts of us, right? Have I got you nervous yet? And this is life. We sometimes find ourselves in those spaces. You know, but life isn't always as fair as just me. You know, there's some people in life that has priorities. There's bad people out there. Right? Some of you have some of these at work. Give me a second. Right? There's some others in our lives that you know, they have an agenda, and it's like they keep on running their agenda. How are you? I think myself is a little deflated. And here's the thing, is we often find ourselves there. Because when one part breaks, all the part breaks. Every single one of them breaks, deflates. When one goes really wrong, everything goes wrong. But I think this analogy is absolutely useless because I did not mention the most important part. See, at the core of your self, more than your relational completeness, more than your productive significance, more than your emotional wellness, more than your life balance, more important than all of these is the very life source of your heart, is the very basis and the foundation of your heart, and that is your spiritual connection. That's what makes us who we are. It's our connection with God. So a balloon is a terrible metaphor. Because it's not as if we had the breath of God blown into us once and for all. No, it's a living, active relationship where God says, no, you get to be connected with me. And yes, you might feel deflated sometimes, but I'll keep on blowing my life's breath into you. When I was a little kid, I hated it when balloons would explode because a little hole and it would be empty. But then I was fascinated by a bouncy castle. And here's the theology of the bouncy castle, okay? The bouncy house theology is that the bouncy house is actually full of holes. Have you noticed that? I mean, they don't even seal the seams of that thing. The air is blowing through it. And yet the bouncy house remains the bouncy house. Regardless of the fact that it's full of holes, regardless of the fact that you have a lot of little kids jumping on top of it, even kids that have had way too much chocolate cake, even they jump on top of it, but they cannot get the bouncy house down. Why is that? Because the bouncy house is connected to the source, and the source is blowing air into the bouncy house quicker than what it can lose it. I think too often we live our lives trying to keep it inflated, and we forget that at the center of our core, the center of our health, the center of our spiritual health, the center of the health of our relationships, the center of the health of our significance at work, the center of our core, our inner person, is the fact that we get to be connected to the source of life. We get to be connected to God. 1 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 16 says this. It says, we have the mind of Christ. Inside of you dwells the mind of Christ. Talk about heart wisdom. Talk about being wise at heart. We have the mentality, the mind, the spirit, the knowledge of Christ inside of us. We have His perspective on this world. We have His way of looking at it. Now, I know that sometimes we forget about that, especially when we're spending all our time on our outside and we forget about our inside. Then we forget about to listen to the mind of Christ, but we have the mind of Christ. Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 10 says this. It says that this new covenant is all about God coming and writing these laws where? On some piece of paper somewhere out there. No, He writes it on our hearts. He writes it on the very inside of who we are. And when Paul's praying for the Ephesian church in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 17, he prays this. He says, then Christ will make His home in your hearts. Christ is at home in your hearts. And yes, life puts on all kinds of pressure in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of unfair ways. Life's putting on pressure. But I want to tell you, when you're connected to the source, when you have Him at home in you, you can live life inflated no matter what, because your inside will always be stronger than the outside. Your inside will always carry longer than the outside. And I'm trusting God that as we journey through this series and we look at the life of David, that God will come and do something. That God will come and stir something. That God will come and establish something on your inside. Not just a wisdom of head, but a wisdom of the heart. I'm trusting God that we will find Christ come and make His home in us. What's happening? Got a balloon? You're carrying your heart on your sleeve, are you? Heart on the outside. I'm trusting God that He would come and stir something, that He would come and ignite something. Maybe you've never experienced God making His home in your heart. Maybe you feel a little bit like my friend over here. A little deflated. A little broken. Maybe your productive significance is not working out. Your work life is not working out as you had hoped. Maybe you're making your way through a health struggle. You're feeling like your body just isn't keeping up. Your body's broken. Maybe you're finding yourself in a relational struggle. You're just not finding that connection. You're struggling through some hard things. Maybe you're just in a space where it's not well with you and yourself. Your emotional wellness is lacking. I don't know where you're at, but I know that there's a spiritual connection. I know that there's a God that is ready to come and make his home with you. I know that Jesus has done everything to make a way through our brokenness, to make his home with us. When David had that big mess up, when he really looked like he was messing it all up, throwing it all away, he wrote a psalm. We have it in our Bibles as Psalm 139. He said, "O Lord, you have examined my heart and you know everything about me." Lord, you have examined my heart and you know everything about me. Lord, we pray today that you would come and examine some hearts. Lord, some inwards are lacking substance, are lacking the ability to keep it all together. And Lord, maybe for too long we've been trying to do it all on our own, through our own strength and our own abilities. And Lord, today we come to you, our good shepherd, that meets us in our spaces of brokenness and our places of emptiness. Lord, you come in these moments. Lord, would you come? Would you just come and make that connection once again? Afresh. Holy Spirit, would you come and breathe into us the life of God? Would you come and speak into us the mind of Christ? Would you come and deposit within ourselves all of you? God, would you come and be breath of life again? Lord, will you come and teach us the wisdom of the heart and the mind of Christ that dwells in our hearts? May we discover that identity. And Lord, as you lead us to places of rest, Lord, may we follow the shepherd of our souls.